Hello and welcome back to Biology for Beginners. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. This week we're going to be wrapping up Chapter 13, How Populations Evolve, by talking about the mechanisms of microevolution. As always, right now the terms and definitions slide should be popping up somewhere around me so that you can either pause the video and grab the vocabulary we will be using today, or you can pop on over to my Patreon, the link is down in the description below, and grab the entire PDF version of my slideshow for absolutely free. However, if you do decide to make my day and become a patron, you will get all the Bio for Beginners information at least a day in advance. So, without further ado, let's get into the topic of today. So, before we really dive into the new stuff, let's have a quick review, since I'm very pro reviews. So, natural selection. Remember, populations consist of varied individuals, and individuals with certain traits will survive and reproduce more than individuals without those traits. And it is the main driving force behind evolution. So, in the little kind of depiction I have here, our population is made up of little hearts. Some of them are pink, some of them are teal. Now, as you can see, as time passes, the teal hearts are doing a little bit better than the pink hearts. So the population has evolved, and now pretty much the only trait we're seeing is that teal trait. And this is just because it's been in some way selected for by natural selection that the teal trait is doing better than the pink trait. So the individuals expressing the pink trait don't survive, don't reproduce, don't pass on their genes as much as those with the teal trait. It's that simple. It's all about who survives and who doesn't. So the first mechanism we're going to talk about here is genetic drift. And basically genetic drift is just chance events that cause the allele frequencies to fluctuate unpredictably. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that genetic drift is going to have a much larger impact on smaller populations than it will have on the larger populations. And this is just because with smaller populations, by definition, you have less genetic material floating around than you do in a larger population, so it's more likely for a trait to be entirely lost. So, one of the big things about genetic drift, and one of the things that you're going to hear about a lot, is something known as the bottleneck effect. And basically the bottleneck effect comes about from usually some catastrophe that may kill like a large portion of the original population and leave a very small population behind. Don't get too hung up on the event that does this. Just know that it's usually some like natural disaster or something. It's something that can't be predicted. So catastrophe is the word we use here. So in this particular image that has been taken from the book, what we see is we have a bottle full of multicolored beads. That's our original population. In this bottle, we have orange, green, and purple individuals. Well, something happens and bottlenecks the population. So it's kind of like shaking the bottle out into a cup. This is literally why it's called the bottleneck effect, because it just kind of reduces that population size. So like a bottleneck, the bottle is wide, but the neck is skinny. That's the whole idea of this. Because it takes this big population, shakes it down by some catastrophe, a large portion of that population is lost, and now, as you can see at the end, our surviving population is just a few purple beads and one green bead. All of the orange genes have been lost, and most of the green genes have been lost. So the surviving population after that bottlenecking event, which in this case was shaking the bottle into the glass, is not really representative of that original population. So that's the whole idea of the bottleneck effect. If you take a big population, there's some bottlenecking event that wipes out a large portion of the original population, and now you have a much smaller surviving population that may or may not accurately represent that original population. And normally, it is not going to represent. So, another portion of this whole idea of genetic drift is that sometimes you won't necessarily have a catastrophic event that's going to violently bottleneck your population. You're just going to have individuals break off from the original population and kind of go off onto their own in a new habitat and establish a brand new population. And this is going to result in what is known as the founder effect. So what we see here, our original parent population has a population of little hearts with the teal, pink, and yellow traits. And this kind of red circle here represents the 2 yellow and 1 pink individuals that, for whatever reason, break off from the original population and moved over into this new purple habitat. And as you can see, the result here is you have a smaller population in the green habitat that now has fewer individuals. It's primarily a teal population with a couple pinks and a yellow hanging about. But our brand new population in that purple habitat is now entirely pink and yellow. There's no green. And the result here is that the brand new population is only going to have genes from the individuals that broke off from that original population. That's the idea here. The founder effect is just literally when individuals break off from a parent population, the new population in the new habitat is only going to carry the genes of the founders of that new population. Now that we've discussed the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, which are the major components of genetic drift, let's talk about gene flow. So gene flow, I know, is something that I mentioned in the previous video and then just didn't really tell you what it was. Well, good news for you, I'm going to be generous and actually clue you into what it is. It's this idea that alleles are gained or lost when fertile individuals migrate from one population to another. And the big deal here is that the individuals that are migrating have to be fertile because they have to be able to breed so that they can pass on their genetic information. And the ultimate result of gene flow is usually the reduction of differences between populations. So while you will get populations that don't really look like the original populations anymore, they're going to start resembling each other. So population A and B may begin by not looking super similar, but as the genes flow between them, they're gonna reach an equilibrium where they look very similar. So continuing on with our little heart examples here, we have our green population that's made up of pink, yellow, and teal hearts, and our purple population here that's made up of pink and yellow hearts. But for whatever reason, this teal heart that's been circled with the red circle decides to migrate over to the purple population. And now the result is our green population still has pink, teal, and yellow individuals. But now our purple population also has pink, teal, and yellow individuals. So now the green and purple populations look just a little bit less different. And as time goes on, the populations will look more and more similar because genes have flowed between them. And that is pretty much gene flow. So now that we've talked about gene flow and genetic drift, we need to really drill this idea into your head that natural selection is not random. Genetic drift and gene flow and mutation, the 3 big things behind natural selection and evolution and all of this stuff, are completely random. Like, mutation is literally just this random chance that the genetic code of an individual is going to change. And genetic drift and gene flow are at their core random. It's either some catastrophic event or individuals breaking off into a new habitat for one reason or another, or migrating to another population. That's entirely random. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. And what we often hear when we hear about the idea of natural selection is it's survival of the fittest. But that's very misleading, and I want you to throw that statement away, because natural selection is not survival of the fittest. Natural selection is ultimately survival of the one that reproduces the most, and that may or may not be the most fit individual, but it's the one that survived and the one that passed its genes on. What actually matters here is relative fitness, not actual fitness. And relative fitness is just the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool relative to the contributions of other individuals. So basically, it's just this individual made many more contributions to the gene pool, meaning it passed its alleles on way more than this individual over here. That's pretty much it. And it's just who produces the most offspring and passes on the most genes to the next generation. It's not necessarily survival of the fittest, because the fittest individuals, again, may or may not be the ones that pass on their genes. They may be fighting more often or doing something else. They may end up not passing on their genes to the next generation. So throw out that idea of survival of the fittest, because that's not what natural selection is. Natural selection literally just looks at the genes that get passed on from one generation to the next. And one really weird example here is that this image of the blue-footed booby we have here. Now, blue-footed boobies are seabirds that are very well adapted to live where they live. They are very good at getting into the water. They're great at swimming, all that fun stuff that you need to be a seabird. And all of this has arisen through these adaptations of their ancestors, making certain individuals better able to survive and pass on their genetic materials. It doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals were stronger than anyone else. It just means they survived, they mated, their genes got passed on, and now we have a bird with a funny name and bright blue feet. So now let's talk about the types of natural selection, because like pretty much anything in the sciencey world, we've broken it down into different types. And the first one we're going to talk about is directional selection. So directional selection is a type of selection that just removes the phenotypes from a population at one extreme. And this type of selection is very common after some sort of environmental change, or when some members of the population move to a new habitat. So those genes at one extreme just might not be available anymore. So let's look at our original population here. We have 5 possible fur color phenotypes for our little mouse population here, ranging from pretty much white to almost black. And what directional selection means is that after some sort of selection pressure, possibly the environment changes so that the more light-furred individuals now stand out more, perhaps the rocks are darker or something. The population is now going to shift towards the 3 darkest phenotypes. So the 2 lightest phenotypes, perhaps they're picked off by predators more now. Those alleles are essentially lost, and the kind of bell curve we see here with the phenotypes just kind of shifts so that now it's towards the darker extreme of this spectrum. The next type of natural selection we're going to talk about is stabilizing selection. And directional selection, remember, removed the phenotypes from one extreme. Well, stabilizing selection removes both of the extreme phenotypes, and basically whatever change occurred here, both of those extreme phenotypes, for some reason, are no longer advantageous in this environment. So perhaps both the very light and very dark individuals now get picked off more frequently by predators. Those alleles are lost. And now the result that we have here is just this middle gray phenotype. Perhaps the habitat shifted and this middle phenotype can hide better against the rocks or the soil or whatever the habitat looks like. But the very light and very dark individuals stand out. They get picked off by hawks, and now our population is just this gray mouse. So the phenotypes at both extremes have been removed. Whereas directional selection, one extreme was removed. Stabilizing, both extremes are gone. And a kind of interesting one, or at least one that I think is an interesting one, is disruptive selection, because it favors the extreme phenotypes. And the kind of result here is that the middle phenotypes are gone, and there's this kind of double humped curve where we have a lot of really light colored individuals and a lot of really dark colored individuals. And this is one of those selections that can be a little bit tricky to understand how it happens. The important thing to remember in intro-level biology class is that disruptive selection is going to favor the extremes and sort of cut out the middleman. So you'll get a lot of the very light color, a lot of the very dark color, but not so much in between. And you can always recognize it by, instead of having one bell curve, you'll have that kind of double humped diagram here. And like, honestly, the big deal to remember between these three types of selection is just being able to tell the difference between them and understanding what makes them happen. Understanding that directional selection, one extreme is lost. The stabilizing selection, both extremes are lost. And the disruptive selection, the two extremes are very much amplified. So now let's talk about sexual selection. And this is another thing that we mentioned kind of at the end of last week's video when we were talking about the Hardy-Weinberg equation in equilibrium. But I mentioned we would go into more detail later. Well, it's later, so let's go into more detail. Because sexual selection is the thing that basically makes mating not random anymore, because it removes that randomness. And the idea of sexual selection is that individuals with certain traits are going to be more likely to obtain mates than individuals without those traits. And one of the main ways that this kind of goes about is because we'll have sexual dimorphism in species. And sexual dimorphism is just physical differences between the sexes, other than differences with the reproductive organs, of course. It's the beautiful plumage on the peacock, whereas if you look at the peahen here, she's quite plain. That is a very extreme sexual dimorphism. And that's a type of sexual selection because the males with the more attractive plumage are going to attract more females. And thus, their mating is not random anymore because there's a selection taking place. And this is a type of natural selection. You can also get sexual selection happening through different vocalizations. So frogs will get very vocal during their mating time, and that's to attract mates. And then we also see sexual selection through combat, like we see with these elk here. And these are just all ways to either attract or prove the toughness or get the right to mate with the females. Now, again, If sexual selection is taking place, it is not random mating. And then the other type of natural selection we need to talk about today is known as a balancing selection. And this is a type of natural selection where there's a stable frequency maintained between two or more phenotypes. And one big thing that causes balancing selection to happen is a thing known as the heterozygote advantage. And the heterozygote advantage is the idea that heterozygous individuals have more reproductive success than either of the homozygotes. Remember, when we're talking about gene pools and natural selection, we're not talking about phenotypes. We don't care what the phenotypes are. We're talking about our genotypes here. So one example of this is the sickle cell allele. Now remember that if you have 2 copies of the allele for sickle cell, you're going to be the homozygous for the recessive allele. You're going to result in having sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia. And you can die for that, ultimately having less reproductive success. However, in areas like Africa, where there are very high incidences of malaria, the homozygous dominant individuals that don't produce the sickle cells can be very susceptible to malaria. So these heterozygous individuals that have some sickled cells and some normal cells end up having the survival advantage over the homozygous dominant. But in areas with less malaria, they have another survival advantage over the homozygous recessive. So there's a balance between the allele frequencies we see in these populations. So before we wrap up, just a few things to remember and take away here. Natural selection cannot and does not fashion perfect organisms because it has no end goal. It's just how things are surviving and what genes are getting passed on. Selection acts only on existing variations, and the phenotypes that are going to be favored may or may not be ideal traits. It's just for some reason this phenotype survived more. And then new advantageous alleles do not just pop up on demand when they're needed. They may or may not pop up ever. Just like, wouldn't it be cool if humans could fly, but we don't have an allele popping up that gives us wings, whether we really, really want it or not. Evolution is going to be limited by historical constraints. And this is really because since new structures cannot come out of nowhere, they can only be sort of fashioned from these structures that are already there. So you have to take what the ancestral organisms had and they have to change and adapt to get to the new structures. You can't just scrap the old structure and start from scratch. You modify the old structure. That's ultimately what happens. And then adaptations are ultimately compromises. The blue-footed booby from before had those lovely blue webbed feet that are perfect for being in the water, but they're pretty clunky for walking around on land. And that's pretty much what adaptations do. You're going to be pretty good with one thing, but it may get in the way somewhere else. But for whatever reason, you've now survived and passed on the genes. So it's a compromise. Again, because perfect organisms are not fashioned through natural selection. And then chance, natural selection, and the environment are constantly interacting with one another. You get these catastrophes, you get natural selection working for the individuals that are surviving, and then the environment's going to throw in curveballs too, which is going to work with natural selection to kind of determine who survives to pass on their genes. So this slide is really some of the big ideas here. anything else in your intro level biology class, know the difference between the types of natural selection and understand that if sexual selection is happening, random mating is not happening. So that's been the end of chapter 13. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.